Alright, here we go. Continuing on with our review concept of Chapter 1. Left off talking about energy and matter as a basic characteristic of life, or needing to acquire that. And I mentioned that energy flows one way, matter is cycled. In acquiring energy, those that make their own food we call producers. There's a new term that maybe you haven't heard of called autotrophs. You want to know what autotrophs are. You think of photosynthesis for autotrophs. So plants are autotrophs. We don't make our own food through photosynthesis, so we are considered heterotrophs. You already know we are consumers. The fancy word, biologically speaking, is heterotrophs. So be sure you know heterotroph and autotroph. The book offers a diagram that helps point out the cycling of matter versus the one-way flow of energy. So make sure that you, again, understand that conceptually. So autotrophs, heterotrophs. And when we talk about energy going one way through organisms, that does get transferred. We get energy from our food, but most of that ends up lost as heat. We don't actually get to use it to make part of ourselves. So that's why we have to keep adding more. So we're losing most energy as heat from metabolism. So if this is a characteristic of living things, we want to make sure we understand what it is. So our bodies respond to our environment internally and externally and note changes that are happening and do things in response to that to try to maintain a relatively stable internal system. So these are some key ideas described from your text. But keep in mind, homeostasis is a process. It isn't a state of being. And again, it's one of life's emergent properties happening at the cellular level. If DNA is a requirement of life, we want to make sure we understand DNA at a very general level. When you think of DNA, hopefully you think of genetics, and you think of genetic information passed on from organism to organism through reproduction. But also, I hope you think of sharing or expressing genes to make proteins in your body. The process of that happening is similar in an organism. But this is what makes us similar as living things, but also is the source of our unique characteristics, and the diversity of life is also part of DNA. So not only is it what we have in common, but it's also what makes us unique. Kind of an interesting catch-22. That's what DNA stands for, deoxyribonucleic acid. So it's guiding our development and functioning as we grow and stay alive. So how do living things vary or differ? It doesn't take much study in biology to recognize there's quite a variety out there of living things. And we can notice how they're similar or different based on their characteristics. When we do that study, we are studying morphology. So anytime you're working to identify, for example, what bird species is in the tree in your bird experiment, you're using morphology, observable characteristics, to help you identify it. So we could come up with any number of ways to organize and classify living things. And when we talk about different kinds of things, we're talking about, or different kinds of life, we're talking about biodiversity. So we want to make sure we understand that term. Most often when we say biodiversity, we refer to different species within a defined area. So we can measure that a tropical rainforest has higher biodiversity than, say, a desert by counting the number of different species in that habitat. Ultimately, the higher the biodiversity in an ecosystem, the more stable or strong that ecosystem is, more resilience built into it. We spent time talking about two classifications of cells in general last year. Some had a nucleus and some did not. So make sure you understand prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells, and which organisms have them. When we say nucleus, make sure we understand nucleus of a cell is what's referred to here. Isn't the same as nucleus of an atom. So nucleus in general just means the center of something. Cellularity may be a new concept, but you also already understand that maybe we have unicellular or single-celled organisms versus this frog or this duckweed, which are multicellular organisms. So scientists ultimately came up with a system to identify each species, give it a name, and categorize it relative to all the other species. And they get lumped together in groups based on how similar they are. They get separated in their classification system by some difference that they might have. So the study of naming and classifying species has a term called, we've heard this before, taxonomy. And the system that we use today is the two-part name system, binomial nomenclature. It was developed by a Swedish botanist named Carolus Linnaeus, and that framework for categorizing life is still used today. What the two-part naming system tells us is that every cataloged species has a two-part scientific name made up of its genus category and species category. The genus is first part capitalized, the second part species is lowercase. So what are those taxonomic levels? Again, hopefully you remember the dumb King Philip cried out for goodness sake. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But if you don't, you can work on it again. So at each level of the system, those that share the same group are in the same taxon. Probably aren't going to use that word again, but their book offers a comparative example. So over here are the different categories. Most general, domain, most specific down here. And what you notice is these are all eukaryotic cells, or eukaryotic celled organisms. They're all plants, so the further they go down in common, the more similar they are, the more closely related they are. So this species, the wild carrot, it gets separated at the order level. You can follow these next ones down to the next level, and they get separated, some of them at the family level. Three major domains. Most of our time and energy is spent focused on these. Plants and animals fit in there. So I've used the word species. We want to make sure we understand what species actually is. Ernest Mayr gave us a definition that biologists tend to use. Any organism that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring with another, they would be considered part of the same species. The problem is, species is made up. We invented that term to describe this phenomenon. So the species concept is actually useful for us when we think of plants and animals, but doesn't really help us when we look at other species like bacteria. So species is useful to a point, but it is an artificial construction as we're trying to describe life, and it breaks down when you get to the molecular or the unicellular level. So a lot of fungus, a lot of, think of lichens, for example, or bacteria. They don't interbreed and have fertile offspring in the traditional way, and so they don't fit that definition of a species very well. Your book tries to also point out that sometimes morphological characteristics can be deceiving. They show you two species here. The top two is one species, the bottom two are another species. So, two forms. But these different species, if you observe them, do not crossbreed. When we talk about traits, those are characteristics organisms have. More often than not, we understand that those are heritable, can pass them on generation to generation genetically. And usually we focus on this, observable physical traits on the outside, morphological characteristics. But if you study organisms, you also know that they have a metabolism, they have physiology going on inside that, and how they work at a molecular level. And those physiological traits can sometimes lead to functional characteristics that are unique to an organism. So we can describe traits that way. And then, of course, the physiology in our bodies also leads to, or is the component leading to, our behaviors. So we can also talk about behavioral traits. So we can maybe expand our understanding of what traits mean. This gets us to the Science of Nature notes, which we already took. And then I will wrap up with one more section, and we'll have Chapter 1 done.